The Wyoming winter of 1889 was merciless. Snow fell in sheets that obscured vision, froze exposed skin within minutes, and turned the landscape into a white wasteland where survival depended entirely on proximity to shelter and warmth. Most people had the good sense to be huddled in homes or cabins, safe behind walls and near fires. Margaret Collins had no such shelter. She had been walking for 3 days. 3 days since leaving the town where she had been turned away from every door, every business, every place that might have offered work or food. She was 24 years old, alone, without family or resources, and the world had decided she had no place in it. The decisions that had led her to this frozen wasteland had been made long before by people who deemed her disposable. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 6. Her mother had died of tuberculosis when Margaret was 16, leaving her alone in a boarding house with no money and no prospects. She had worked as a seamstress, as a maid, as anything she could find, but wages were never enough, and employers seemed to believe that a woman without family protection was fair game for exploitation. After being assaulted by her last employer and then blamed for seducing him, Margaret had been cast out from the boarding house and the town. She had wandered from place to place, rejected everywhere, until she found herself on a frozen road in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the certainty that she would die. She had stopped trying to find towns or people. She had stopped hoping for help. She had simply walked, because stopping meant freezing, and some part of her, though she wasn't sure why, still resisted death. That's when she saw the gate. It was wooden, sturdy, marking the boundary of a ranch. Beyond it, Margaret could see smoke rising from a cabin chimney. Warmth, life, everything she needed but had no right to ask for. She made her way to the gate on legs that barely functioned, her body shutting down from cold and hunger. She tried to open the gate, but her frozen fingers couldn't manage it. She collapsed against the wooden posts, certain this was where she would die, so close to warmth and shelter, but unable to reach them. That's where Jacob Mercer found her. Jacob was a solitary man in his early 50s who had built his ranch through decades of hard work and careful management. He had never married, had few friends, and preferred the company of horses and land to people. He was riding out to check on his cattle before the worst of the storm hit when he noticed a figure collapse against his gate. For a moment, he thought it might be an animal, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person, a woman, frozen nearly solid, barely breathing, and clearly at the threshold of death. Jacob didn't hesitate. He dismounted, carefully lifted Margaret, who was barely conscious, and brought her inside his cabin. He moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of managing emergencies on his own. He stripped away her frozen clothing, wrapped her in blankets warmed by the fire, and began the delicate process of bringing her core temperature back up without causing shock. The first night, he wasn't sure she would survive. Her breathing was shallow. Her skin was dangerously pale. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words that made no sense. But Jacob stayed awake, monitoring her condition, adjusting the blankets, providing water when she was conscious enough to drink. He had learned long ago that survival often came down to small interventions: warmth, water, food, and time. By the second day, Margaret's breathing had stabilized. By the third day, she opened her eyes and looked at Jacob with an expression of confusion and fear. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My cabin," Jacob replied simply. "I found you at my gate. You were freezing. You're safe now." Margaret tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. Fear crossed her face. "What do you want from me?" she asked, and there was something in the question, the resignation, the expectation of exploitation, that told Jacob volumes about what this woman had experienced. "Nothing," he said firmly. "You were dying. I brought you inside. That's all." Over the following weeks, as Margaret recovered, Jacob asked no questions about her past, made no demands, and offered her something she had never experienced: genuine human kindness without expectation of repayment. He prepared warm meals for her. He brought her clean clothes. He set up a comfortable room where she could recover without pressure or judgment. And most importantly, he treated her with a basic respect that suggested he believed she had value simply by existing. Margaret had expected that once she was strong enough, She would be cast out, just as she had been cast out from everywhere else. But Jacob made no moves to evict her. Instead, as her strength returned, he began to involve her in the functioning of the ranch. "I could use help managing the household," he said one afternoon as she sat by the fire, still recovering. "Cooking, cleaning, organizing. It's a lot for one person. Would you be interested in helping? I'd pay you fair wages." Margaret was stunned. Employment, wages, the possibility of supporting herself through honest work. "Yes," she said, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, I would." Over the next months, Margaret became an integral part of Jacob's ranch operations. She managed the household with capability and care. She organized the stores. She cooked meals that transformed his simple diet into something nourishing and comforting. And slowly, as she worked, something shifted in her understanding of the world. She was not disposable. She was valuable. Her work mattered. Her presence mattered. Jacob, watching her transform from a frightened, starving woman into someone confident and capable, found himself experiencing feelings he had never expected to have. He was falling in love with her, not because he had rescued her, but because of who she was becoming, who she had always been beneath the trauma and rejection. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Jacob spoke carefully. "Margaret," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that your answer doesn't change your position here. You can say no, and everything remains as it is. You have employment, you have a home, you have safety. That's not contingent on your response to what I'm about to say." Margaret turned to look at him, her expression wary but not afraid. Jacob had proven himself trustworthy in ways she hadn't thought possible. "I have come to love you," Jacob continued, "not because I rescued you, but because I've come to know you, because I've watched you recover and become stronger, because your presence in my life has made it infinitely richer. I'm asking if you consider marrying me, not for security or obligation, but as my equal partner, as the woman I want to build a life with." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Tears of disbelief, of joy, of the overwhelming realization that she had finally found someone who saw her worth. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their marriage took place in spring of 1890, on the ranch where Jacob had found her dying. The ceremony was simple, attended by a few neighbors and ranch hands. And as Margaret spoke her vows, she understood something profound. She had been saved not by rescue, but by being chosen, by being claimed not as an obligation, but as a treasure. Over the following years, Margaret became known throughout Wyoming as a woman of strength and capability. She managed Jacob's household with brilliant efficiency. She helped other women in difficult circumstances, offering them employment and support. She became a voice for women's rights and dignity. But most importantly, she became a living testimony to the transformative power of being valued. Years later, when people asked Margaret about the moment Jacob found her at the gate, about the moment she understood she would survive, she spoke with the kind of clarity that comes from genuine transformation. "I was dying," Margaret would say simply. "I had been dying slowly for years, dying under the weight of a world that had decided I had no value. When Jacob found me, I was already gone in every way that mattered. But he looked at a woman who was freezing, starving, and broken, and he saw someone worth saving. Not because I was special or exceptional, but because he understood that being human is enough, that mere existence deserves dignity and care." She would pause, emotion visible on her face. "The greatest gift he gave me wasn't rescue," she would continue. "It was claiming. He looked at me at my absolute worst, frozen, starving, desperate, and he said, 'You're mine now. You belong here. You belong with me.' That's when I understood I had worth. That's when I stopped being disposable and became treasured." Jacob and Margaret lived together for 42 years. They never had biological children, but they took in several young people who had been abandoned or rejected by society, giving them the same gift Jacob had given Margaret, the belief that they had value, that they deserved care, that they belonged. When Jacob died at 94, Margaret was at his side, and when she spoke at his funeral, she made sure everyone understood what he had done. "This man found me dying," she told the gathered community. A woman so broken, so rejected, so disposable that the entire world had written her off. He could have ridden past. He could have assumed I was someone else's problem. But he stopped. He brought me inside. He warmed me. He fed me. He employed me. And eventually, he loved me. Through his actions, he proved that worth is not something you earn or deserve. Worth is inherent. And the greatest act of love is simply claiming that worth in another person and refusing to let the world convince him otherwise. Margaret lived for another 8 years after Jacob's death. She spent those years continuing his work, helping women in desperate circumstances, providing employment and shelter, offering the same message Jacob had offered her. You are not disposable. You belong. You have value. On her grave, simple words were inscribed, Margaret Mercer. She was starving at a gate. A man claimed her. Through her life, she claimed thousands of others. And in Wyoming, the Mercer Foundation, established to help women in desperate circumstances, continued a legacy of two people who understood that sometimes the greatest revolutionary act is simply refusing to treat someone as disposable and instead claiming them as forever